Hey, welcome to 316, a Bible study of Bridgeway Church out of Tampa, Florida. My name is Joel Eason, and I'm honored that you're with us for this study as we're looking at the summary of the book of Obadiah. In this series, we've been looking at the minor prophets. In a past set of studies, we went through major prophets, and we're looking at the minor ones, and today we find ourselves with Obadiah. And so hopefully you've been along with us for the ride. If maybe you've missed some of those previous ones, we'd love to have you look back at those and study with us. Typically they're in the range from 30 minutes up to 40 minutes, and but they don't take too long. But we hope they serve as a kind of a push forward with an overview of what the book is talking about, what the prophet was dealing with, and then hopefully you can take the study even further and connect it with different references in the New Testament, and we hope these are a blessing to you. But I'm going to go ahead and jump on over to our look that we walk through, and as we contemplate Obadiah, we'll start tonight off with a couple of things, a who and a what. So when we talk about the book of Obadiah, it is the shortest book in the Old Testament. We're only talking about 21 verses, so it's a very summarized kind of look that we'll have here, but it's not long at all. Now, when we come to the person of Obadiah, as you see on your screen, we don't know a lot about him, almost nothing. Sometimes the prophet will give indication as to the town they're coming from, or some of the backdrop that they're in the midst of. For instance, in our previous study, we knew with Amos, we knew that Amos was coming from the town of Tekoa. Well, we can find that, and so we know that he's in the southern region. We know about Hosea with his marriage and the children that he was dealing with. A number of the major prophets, we are able to identify a number of things with them. And one of the things that we've pushed on in this study of the prophets out of the scripture is that it's also a study of the kings. So when you have a king, you often had the era of the prophets. I'll just kind of insert a general overview of that. When we go back to with Israel, the first king being King Saul, the one who institutes him and who does the anointing and the declaration nationally, it was Samuel. Well, the Apostle Paul in the book of Acts identifies Samuel as the first prophet. He's the first prophet over in the Old Testament. And I know there's a verse that identifies Moses as being a prophet, but in the context of what Paul is pointing to, he would have identified Samuel as that first prophet of the company of prophets. We know that he would eventually start, we call it the school of prophets, some call it a company of prophets, but kind of that office of people that would study the law, study the Torah, and then give declaration, because a prophet was one that declared before he was one that was talking about futuristic things. Well, when we trace from Samuel and Saul, we also have Samuel and David, and then you get into the point of Solomon, and then the kingdom fractures, and you have the 10 northern tribes and the 2 southern tribes. And in the era of kings leading the people of God astray, God would raise up a prophet, and they would speak to this. You would have Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel, who were primary prophets simply by the quantity of what they wrote or spoke. And the minor prophets are not less significant. There's just not as much data. Case in point, Obadiah. We're going to deal with one chapter here. And when they would identify the king, then you identify the time. So for instance, back to Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 6 says, in the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord high and lifted up, and there's this great calling that comes to that. Well, we can pinpoint by time King Uzziah's time period when he reigned, so we know when Isaiah is prophesying. We know from Jeremiah and we know from Ezekiel that they're prophesying much, much later, and they're prophesying down in the Jerusalem area, because they're talking about the kings of Judah in that time period. And so when we come to Obadiah, We have no king listed here. Now, I will say that we do have a time range that most scholars will identify, and I'm going to save that to show it to you later because it's kind of a reference that he makes that most scholars will say, okay, this has to have been at this time. So we'll point to that in just a bit. But we don't know tons about Obadiah. We know for sure he is not the Obadiah that is highlighted in 1 Kings chapter 18, and that was with Elijah. That is a much, much earlier time period, and that is much further north where Elijah would have been. We do know for the book of Obadiah that you are dealing with a prophecy against the Edomites. And that really is the main thing to think about today in this study, is that the book of Obadiah is a prophecy against the Edomites. Now, we're going to pick up looking at some verses and we'll start to kind of conclude this. So it says in Obadiah chapter 1, the vision of Obadiah, this is what the sovereign Lord says about Edom. So we know we're dealing with the Edomites here. We have heard a message from the Lord, an envoy which was sent to the nations to say, rise and let us go against her for battle. See, I will make you small among the nations, you will be utterly despised. So this is already starting with a very negative statement towards Edom, that he is going to make them small. It is going to get far, far worse as this prophecy goes. But let's come back to the first verse, and that is that it's to Edom. Now, to do an understanding, or to gain an understanding of Edom, who they were, where they were, we want to first rewind the clock all the way back to Genesis. We want to come back to Genesis, and we want to look at Abraham's family. So you know this history most likely is that you have Abraham being called by God there in the middle of Genesis, and he's called by God to follow, and that God will make a great nation out of him. He promises him a child. And we know the story about Ishmael coming by way of Sarah's maidservant Hagar. And then we know that God says that's not the blessing. And then Sarah is going to give birth to Isaac. Isaac will eventually be married to a girl named Rebecca. And then there's going to be a set of twins that are born to Isaac. And you're going to have Esau and you're going to have Jacob. And I'm intrigued by their story as twins because I'm the father of a set of twins. And so I'm intrigued by relationship of twins together. But what have you, you have Esau and Jacob, and I'm going to just kind of lean and talk about three things that happen early on with Esau and Jacob that actually connect all the way to the Edomites. So the first one would be birth. We're going to look at some verses there. Second, I will talk about birthright and blessing. Okay, so let's kind of just sit in on the birth side. And so when you see one, I'm just talking about those 1, 2, 3 categories. So on the first category of birth, you'd have out of Genesis 25, Isaac prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was barren. The Lord answered his prayer, and his wife Rebekah became pregnant. Now, keep in mind, as we look at verse 22, this is long before the era of sonograms, right? So it says the babies jostled each other within her. So she would have at some point known, I'm pregnant, and then there would have been an activity internally that she would have been alarmed by. No indication probably to her that she was having twins, and she's, disturbed by this. The babies jostled each other within her, and she said, why is this happening to me? So she went to inquire of the Lord. Let's keep going. It says in verse 23, the Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb. You are having twins. Pause there. I remember when my wife and I found out we were having twins, it was at a sonogram. And the nurse practitioner was so cavalier in how she said it. She said, there's 2. And we did not know there was 2. And my wife was laying on, the table or on that sonogram little bed chair. I'm standing up. My wife, when she said, you're having 2, she comes flying up. I drop down, into the chair. It was really kind of the stuff of movies. And it was like, what? So you have this story where God is telling her there's twins inside of you, and there are two nations in your womb, and two peoples from with you, and you will be separated. And this would have been hard, I think, because God is indicating there's going to be tension between them. And if you've had children, you know you want your kids to get along and you want there to be peace. And God is indicating there's going to be tension between them. And he says one people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger, which would have been a paradox, because in that hierarchy of time, you would not have had the older serving the younger. The younger always would have served the older. And so this would have been something that I think she would have filed away and would have shown up in some of her behavior later. So I'll kind of address that in a second. So continuing on the birth story here, we have when the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys in her womb. First to come out was red, and so just a red hue to his skin, and his whole body was like a hairy garment. That's interesting. Not just his head. We've seen some hairy kids on their head, but there's hair on his body. And so they named him Esau, which literally came from a Hebrew term indicating coarse and hairy, like from an animal almost. After this, and I'm not indicating Esau was an animal, but it was coarse. It was not smooth, After this, his brother came out with his hand grasping Esau's heel, so he was named Jacob. And so Jacob was a term for supplanter, to grab something that's not yours. Some people will call him deceiver because of what he took along the way, and that probably is a fitting definition, but still, at its base, supplanter is the word that commonly gets used for Jacob, or Jacob as we would say it, and he's grabbing hold of that heel. So when we look at this, Jacob will become the father of the Israelites. Now, we know, if we can recall in our Genesis history, Jacob's going to wrestle with the angel of the Lord. The angel of the Lord is going to contend with him during the course of the night, and then he changes his name. From this point forward, you will not be called Jacob or Jacob, you will be called Israel. God is with you, the Lord is with you, you've contended with the Lord, and he's named Israel, and from him would be the Israelites. Well, Esau, he would go on to become the father of the Edomites. So whenever we're tracing Edom, we know it's coming back to its lineage of Esau. So that'll show up in Obadiah's prophecy. That's why I'm going to this extent to kind of talk about it, because Obadiah is going to identify Esau, and it wouldn't make any sense if we didn't understand Esau's connected to the Edomites. He's the father of them. Second thing would be the birthright and the father's blessing. So, and you can do your own study in these sections, but in chapter 25, we know that as they got older, that Esau's more of a hunter. He's more of a rugged guy. A lot of preachers will make fun with this and say one was kind of, that outdoorsman and strong Home Depot kind of guy, and Isaac was more kind of Bed Bath & Beyond kind of guy. He was an indoor, he's a cook. He was I don't know that you can make all those kind of, scenarios. We just know that Esau was rough and a hunter, and we know that Isaac is found at home. And he's prepared this meal. His brother comes home. His brother wants some of it. And there's this exchange in which Jacob is going to say, give me your birthright. Esau's going to say, fine. And whether or not this was portrayed or seen as an official transfer of birthright in Esau's eyes, my opinion is he probably didn't think that was legitimate, and it was just, whatever, like you would to brothers. But it was a legitimate statement that was made, and the benefit of a birthright came with a lot of different things. There came some seniority within the family, but also whenever their father, which was Isaac, when he would die, the birthright would have given the oldest, or the one who held the birthright, the right to double the portion of inheritance than the younger. So he basically is transferring the inheritance, and we'll find out blessing, to Jacob instead of upon himself, which is interesting, because then you go to chapter 27. Once again, we have another scenario where there's some hunting involved. Isaac is old. He can't see well. Knows he's going to be dying soon. He's going to bless his children. And and so Esau's going to go out to prepare a meal to come back to receive the blessing. While that's happening, Rebekah and Jacob deceive Isaac into blessing. You know, they put this skin and this hair on his hands, and famously Isaac's going to say that it's the voice of Jacob, but it's the skin of Esau. He's going to be deceived. Now, in my opinion, just kind of connecting dots, I think that the reason Rebekah helps Jacob in this context is because when they were in her womb jostling, and the Lord told her the younger or the older will serve the younger, it's my guess and opinion that she felt some measures of obligation to help bring about this. Now, I could be reading in more than I should read into it, but I don't think that that should not be at least considered, that she may have felt some inclination to help Jacob for the blessing of God on his life. But, you know, either way, there ends up being this very strong divide between Jacob and Esau. And we know that there's some forms of reconciliation that happen later. But that brings us then back to Obadiah and to thinking about this verse, because it says in verse 3, the pride of your heart, and this is going to Edom, the people that originated from Esau's line, the pride of your heart has deceived you. You will live in the clefts of the rocks and make your home on the heights. You who say to yourself, who can bring me down to the ground? Though you soar like the eagle and make your nest among the stars, from there I will bring you down, declares the Lord. Now, I want to show you a couple of things, so I'll come back to this verse, but I think a map and some photos might help us understand God saying, you think you're safe, and you're not. So let's kind of look at a map, and then I'll show you some photos. So here's a map that we used last week as we were talking about Amos, and I would just highlight, if we work from the center, we have Israel, divided kingdom, northern 10 tribes is Israel, southern 2 tribes is that lavender, Judah. You have Jerusalem, remember Tekoa right under that, that's where Amos is from. And I'm going to come back to this a little later and point something on the other side of the Jordan River. Do you see this blue line going vertically up through Israel? That's the Jordan River. I'm going to come back to that a little later. But for now, let's look down at yellow, and that's Edom. Okay, Edom was south of the Dead Sea. That blue section right above it is the Dead Sea. And you have Edom down there. And Petra, if you've ever heard of Petra, is about where it's marked on the screen, where I've put the @Petra sign. That Edom area would have been descendants of Esau. Now, he said, you who think you're safe on the cliffs, that you're impenetrable. Let me show you. We had a team of people in Petra this past just about 6 months ago or so, and I'll show you some photos from Petra. I took these photos, so these are coming from my phone, and I don't really want to highlight so much the architecture that's cut into the rocks. Petra is famous for this area that was carved out, and you can do your own research and kind of look at the elements of Petra. What I want you to see is the cragginess, the jadedness of the cliffs, that it's a hard place. I want you to see that it's high. It would be very difficult for armies to come through. So I'll show you another one. So this is coming down, and this looks like, in one regard, if you're looking at it, like a person could walk down that, like that's a pathway that you would ride a donkey down. Expand that. If I'm down in the bottom, kind of that canyon portion, I'd be small there. That's not like 6 feet of height of rock. That's, you know, very, very, it's high. There's a lot of hardness there. I'll show you one more. When you're down below, rocks jet up very, very high. The cliffs jet up very high. And so you keep that kind of in mind. Now let me show you that verse again. You who live in the clefts of the rock and make your home on the heights, you think nobody can get to you. And he says, you're going to be brought down. Now, let's continue over to verse 6 because he connects it to Esau now. And he says, but how Esau will be ransacked, his hidden treasures pillaged. Will I not destroy the wise men of Edom, men of understanding in the mountains of Esau? So that's the area that you saw. And it covers a lot more territory than just Petra. But it all looks in that kind of context. You warriors, O Timnon, will be terrified, and everyone in Esau's mountains will be cut down in the slaughter. Now, when you see this, he is depicting that you think you're safe, but you're going to be brought down. Now, let me take you one more verse here, and then we'll make an application. This is the reason. You say, why is God coming against Edom? We saw it on the map. We saw kind of some pictures from where they would have been in that kind of general kind of geography. And he says, because of the violence against your brother Jacob. Remember, all of this traces back to Jacob and Esau. The Edomites and the Israelites trace back all the way to Genesis. Because of the violence against your brother Jacob, or the Israelites, you will be covered with shame. You will be destroyed forever. And then this is the key one. Don't miss this. I don't know if it's the most important verse in all of Obadiah, but it gives us context. On the day you stood aloof while strangers carried off his wealth and his foreigners entered his gates and cast lots for Jerusalem, you were like one of them. So when he says on the day you stood aloof while strangers carried off Jacob or Israel's wealth, what is being talked about here is widely understood and embraced and agreed upon by scholars that what is being pointed at here is the Babylonian captivity, the final captivity that is happening within Jerusalem. Now, when the Babylonians attack Jerusalem, we can go back to our study of Jeremiah. There's two waves of that. The final one, the final departing and the final conquering of Jerusalem happens in 586 BC. There's a wave that happens before. That's when your Daniel would have been pulled out of Jerusalem and he's taken to Babylon. It's most likely that Ezekiel was in that company as well because both of them prophesy as exiles. But if we take this as the final conquering and burning and devastation to Jerusalem, that would have been 586 BC. And the indication here gives us time and it gives us some measures of location. But the real burden here is that they did nothing in defense of their lineage, their brother in lineage. They stood aloof and watched this. And that becomes this powerful thing when, if I were to look at, call it one more verse, you should not look down on your brother in the day of his misfortune, nor rejoice over the people of Judah in the day of their destruction, nor boast so much in the day of their trouble. Like you did nothing about this. And, so if we were to say around 586, this is happening. And that brings me to something, it's going to feel like I'm completely going a different direction here. That brings me to, if I pause Obadiah, and I think of the line, your sin will find you out. Have you ever heard that? In Christian circles, we'll hear that. Your sin will find you out. Where does that come from? Like, where does that story come from? And that's where I want to come back to the map. I'm going to show you a completely separate passage of Scripture, and then we'll come back and finish Obadiah. So if we keep your sin will find you out, and we jump back to our map, now let's look in, try and zero in if you can. Hopefully you're on a device or have, your YouTube playing HD where you can see some of this a little clearer and it's not kind of fuzzy. But where you see Israel, the orange section, and you see to the east of the Jordan River, that orange section that's butted up to Ammon and Moab, that orange section would be an area referred to as Gilead. Gilead is over in that area bumping into Ammon. And this is where the Israelites were going to come over and cross the Jordan River. Joshua is the one that leads them across the Jordan River, and they're going to go on campaign to, possess the land. If we go all the way down towards where the Jordan River and the Dead Sea connect, just to the west of that is where Jericho is. So they're coming across that area. Now keep this in mind. They have yet to cross over that Jordan River into the Promised Land. And two of the tribes, of the 12 tribes of Israel, two of the tribes are going to come to Moses with a request. In Numbers 32, we read this: the Reubenites and Gadites, who had very large herds and flocks, saw that the lands of Jazer and Gilead, so that's that orange section that we're talking about, were suitable for livestock. So they came to Moses and Eleazar, the priest, and to the leaders of the community. They said, "Let this land be given to your servants as our possession. Do not make us cross the Jordan." So two of the 12 tribes wanted to not go into battle, did not want to cross the Jordan River, wanted to just possess that one orange area that we were talking about. I'll show it to you again. The two tribes said, let us not have to cross the Jordan River. Let us stay in this area and we'll make our life here. Moses thinks about it, and this is what he says to him. Moses said to the Gadites and Reubenites, "Shall your countrymen go to war while you sit here?" Now you notice this is verse 6. We're going to pick up in verse 20. They have dialogue back and forth. You can read it for yourself, but there's a negotiation that happens. And the Reubenites and Gadites propose that we go fight with you and then we get to come back. And after everything is done, we get to come back and inherit this area that we're asking for. And so it says in verse 20, then Moses said to them, if you'll do this, if you'll arm yourselves before the Lord for battle, if all of you will go armed over the Jordan before the Lord until he's driven his enemies out before him. Verse 22, then when the land is subdued before the Lord, you may return and be free from your obligation to the Lord and to Israel. And this land will be your possession before the Lord. And then you have that famous statement, but if you fail to do this, you will be sinning against the Lord, and you may be sure that your sin will find you out. So that phrase, your sin will find you out, that could be used in a lot of different terms. As a youth pastor, I heard it, probably even used it myself as a student, as a teenager when I gave my life to the Lord, heard it all the time, your sin will find you out. And I'm not debating the concept of it. I will say the context of it comes all the way back to if your brothers are in danger and you do nothing about the danger your brothers are in, God says, I'll hold you accountable to that. I will hold you accountable for doing nothing. When there's evil that is happening to your brothers and you just sit by and you say, not my problem, God indicates that'll be sin, and your sin will find you out. And we would think, I didn't do anything. I'm aloof. I'm standing back. And the whole judgment of the book of Obadiah is coming at Edom for their aloofness at not doing anything to help the Israelites. So picking back up at verse 15, and we'll start to head home with this. The day of the Lord is near for all nations. As you've done, it will be done to you. Your deeds will return upon your own head. And then verse 18, the house of Jacob will be a fire, the house of Joseph a flame, the house of Esau be stubble, and they'll set it on fire and consume it. There will be no survivors from the house of Esau. The Lord has spoken. Now, let me just say, there are no survivors of the Edomites to this day. As a people, they came to a ceasing point. And you won't find lineage from the Edomites at all, anywhere. And it's a fascinating prophecy that came to be fulfilled where Israel finds new birth and grows again and finds, kind of a vitalness later where the Edomites would be destroyed. They would be attacked from the Babylonians and then utterly destroyed, entirely eliminated with the era of the Romans. But you find in this, what follows in the last verses are talking about some land, and it's talking about the Lord's sovereignty in all these areas. But I'm intrigued as we start to kind of land of probably the most famous Edomite outside of Esau would be King Herod. So let me lean on that. So we jump to the New Testament, right? And you have King Herod. And Herod is the one in Matthew chapter 2 that these wise men come to. We've seen the star in the east and we've come to worship. And Herod says, when you find him, come back. I'd like to worship too. And we know that whole story. And he ends up causing the death of, all these babies 2 years and younger throughout all the Bethlehem area and surrounding territories. And he was the first of what is referred to as the Herodian dynasty. King Herod's got sons, and his sons, they're all a mess. That's a whole separate conversation about, their lineage. One of his sons, actually two of his sons, are the ones involved with John the Baptist. One had lost his wife to a brother. John the Baptist is the one that's saying, this is sin, this is wrong, and they have him arrested. And so it's an interesting kind of look at the Herodian dynasty. Well, King Herod's dad, as you can see on your screen, was Antipater of the Idumeans, and they were Edomites. And so I find that to be fascinating as Obadiah comes to a close, and we think historically that this last famous Edomite is trying to have killed the seed and the savior of the Israelites. And one of these would go into complete obscurity only to be stubble, and one would be vibrant and aflame, not just within the world, but eternally. And so it's a fascinating little book that has pictures and prophecy both back to Genesis and also points to the posterity of the work of God through Jesus Christ. And so that's a summary of the book of Obadiah. And I hope this has been a blessing to you. I hope that you'll take the study and take it even further as you dig in on words and dig in on connections within other portions of the scripture. And I hope that you'll be able to join us as we continue the study next with Jonah. God bless you, and I'll see you soon.